32 past the hour this morning, the United Nations top court ordered Israel to take all measures to prevent genocide from taking place in Gaza, but did not order a ceasefire. The International Court of Justice said it would not throw out a case by South Africa accusing Israel of committing genocide in its war efforts. The court said that Israel must improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza and preserve any evidence of alleged genocide. In response, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu released a statement that reads in part, quote, "The charge of genocide leveled against Israel is not only false, it is outrageous. Decent people everywhere should reject it." Meanwhile, this morning, the U.S. State Department announced that it has paused funding for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees following allegations that several of its employees may have been actually involved in the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel. Joining us now, NBC's Matt Bradley from Tel Aviv. Matt, what does this ICJ ruling mean, and what happens next?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jose. We don't actually know. I mean, the most immediate thing, and one of the stipulations in the ruling, was that Israel needs to come up with a report within a month and present it to the ICJ showing exactly how it's been complying with the ICJ's provisions, those things you just mentioned. Providing aid, making sure they're not tampering with any evidence of genocide, making sure that they're not committing acts of genocide. So that really is the next most immediate step. The actual ruling on whether or not Israel is committing genocide, that's still in the court, and that could take years to come up with. But we have to remember that this is a ruling that's not necessarily going to have teeth because the ICJ doesn't have a police force. It can't throw people in jail, but it will pile some diplomatic pressure on Israel. And it could really energize a lot of the global community who's been calling for a permanent ceasefire. We've been hearing deafening requests of the Israelis to stop the incursion in the Gaza Strip that's now killed more than 26,000 Gazans, most of them, according to the Hamas-run Ministry of Health, civilians. Now, this is a UN body, the ICJ, so this will probably go to the United Nations Security Council. They can make some sort of demand of the Israelis, but the United States, who has a permanent seat on the Security Council, they can always block anything that's critical of Israel. They've done this very often in the past. So really what happens next? Well, this is really an unusual moment here, I got to tell you, Jose, because the fact is there's kind of something for everybody in this ruling. We've heard praise of this ruling from the South Africans, from the Palestinians, and even from the Israelis. That comment you just mentioned from Benjamin Netanyahu, he was happy that the court didn't decide that the Israelis needed to halt their offensive in the Gaza Strip, though later on in that comment, he did say that the fact that the court heard the allegations from South Africa itself was a disgrace. And even further, right-wing ministers within his cabinet have called the ruling anti-Semitic. But, this is something that probably won't move the dial on the ground in the Gaza Strip. But it is a very symbolic and important diplomatic measure for everyone involved. Jose?
Matt Bradley in Tel Aviv, thank you so much. And joining us now is Ambassador Alon Pincus, former Israeli Consul General in New York. Ambassador, always a pleasure to see you. I thank you for your time. What was your first reaction to this International Court of Justice's decision, partial decision, today?
Well, okay, Jose, it's like this, like a yellow card in soccer and football. It was a stern warning. And, there are two ways of looking at it, or two takeaways. The first is the court said that, the court refrained from asking Israel to cease fire and to immediately halt any military operations. Had it chose to do so, it would have vindicated the argument that there could be a genocide, or that conditions for a genocide, for some form of genocide, exist. The court did not do that. On the other hand, as Matt Bradley, your correspondent, accurately put it, the court did issue provisional orders for Israel, all of which amount to a suspicion that those conditions for genocide could be met. Now, this is not genocide from a legal point of view because you need to prove intent. And intent is a very difficult thing to prove, and I'm pretty satisfied that there's absolutely no intent on Israel's side. However, if you look at the humanitarian aid and the medical aid that is stipulated in the ruling, you see that even though it's not mentioned specifically, Jose, The court is essentially saying there should be a ceasefire. Now, tie this now to the possibility of a hostage deal that is being discussed, deliberated, or negotiated, mediated by Qatar and indirectly by the U.S. And that also includes an extended ceasefire. So take those two together. We're looking at the possibility of a ceasefire. In and of itself, the decision was less than what Israel feared, but it's a major, major slap on the wrist.
Yeah, and Ambassador, you signed a letter along with 40 other former Israeli officials who are now calling on Prime Minister Netanyahu to resign. What do you think needs to happen? What needs to change?
But look, to be honest, Jose, he should have resigned on October 7th, and then on November 7th, and then December 7th, and then January 7th, and he's probably going to get to February 7th without resigning. So this letter is more an expression of will and wishful thinking rather than a prescription or a plan of action. He needs to resign now. If he doesn't resign, resignation is nothing that I expect him to do. What he needs to do, what the political system needs to do, is to call for an election. Obviously, there is a heightened level of frustration with him in the U.S. and the Biden administration. Obviously, he has not cooperated on American visions of post-war Gaza. And obviously, he's not a partner in Americanized to a what's called a reconfigured Middle East. So the pressure, the domestic pressure, and the international pressure, particularly that coming from the U.S., will, I think, in the next 2-3 months, force him into calling for an early election. Now, there's one more thing, if I may add, Jose.
Yes.
His coalition is going to be extraordinarily resistant and opposed to the combination of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice's ruling, and the hostage deal, on grounds that a ceasefire fails to address Israel's war objectives, toppling, eliminating, eradicating, annihilating Hamas. And so I could see his coalition. I mean, there's a possibility of his coalition imploding within those 2-3 months period.
Ambassador Alon Pincus, thank you very much for being with us. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Jose. Thank you.
We are learning new details today about the harrowing scenario facing civilians inside Gaza. The Washington Post details a story of a 27-year-old woman's experience giving birth to her 4th child in the midst of this conflict. Her uncle's cell phone flashlight, all they had to see by, where he delivered his niece's baby on the spot of a cold earth between tents. Quote, they cut the boy's umbilical cord with an unsterilized scalpel, and they filled tin cans with hot water to keep him warm. Joining us now, Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan, pediatric intensive care doctor from Doctors Without Borders. She is also the co-founder of Gaza Medic Voices. I thank you, doctor, for your time. How does this story compare to what you're hearing on the ground there in Gaza?
Yeah, people who have seen everything, colleagues of mine who have been in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, have been working in the humanitarian sector for decades, have run out of words to describe this. I ran out of words to describe this over 2 months ago now. That story that you just shared is one of so many stories that we hear on a daily basis. Some that I can share with you right now. What is clear is that conditions are utterly catastrophic. And every story is, the subject of nightmares, things that we never thought we would get to, not in our lifetime, not in the 21st century. At this point, you mentioned earlier the staggering numbers of those killed and injured thus far. Just today, in the past 24 hours, almost 200 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, and over 350 have been injured. And unfortunately, we can't get data from the central and northern parts of Gaza, where it is very difficult to get communications, where hospitals are essentially almost entirely out of function. And as you know, there are still thousands trapped under the rubble that cannot be counted in those figures, some that may be alive, the majority of whom are probably dead at this point. The amount of suffering in the Gaza Strip for those who are still alive is really indescribable. They are besieged, unable to flee, have been told forcibly displaced multiple times to areas they are told are safe, which in effect don't turn out to be safe, as has been the case with even the organization I work for, Médecins Sans Frontières, who on multiple occasions was thought to be operating under safe or deconflicted circumstances. And unfortunately, we have lost 4 of our colleagues who were killed in attacks. And the entire population who has survived so far is displaced. The majority are living in tents in the cold of the winter. I'm speaking to you from Amman, Jordan at the moment, and I am telling you I am indoors in a heated home and I'm still cold and it is raining outside. I cannot imagine what life is for all of these people, and for the particularly, you know, the tens of thousands of children and newborn babies that require very warm conditions to survive.
And I want to talk to you about that because, you know, in a war, and a war is always just the most horrible representation of humanity. In a war where there are no, on one side, Hamas, you know, these are not people in uniform, so they're to discern who is Hamas and who is a civilian is in and of itself difficult. But then there's the issue of women, pregnant women and children. Those clearly are not fighters. And so their plight is included in that complicated, confused battle going on every day in Gaza. How can the world, how can we help specifically those that are clearly humanitarians, that are civilians, and how can we help them in a humanitarian fashion?
Look, the demographics of those who've been killed in Gaza so far almost exactly mirror the demographics of the population. Those are not the demographics of war victims normally. Normally, war victims are predominantly young men. What we're seeing in Gaza is about 70% of those killed so far are women and children. Though what are being considered targets are hospitals, clinics, schools, mosques, churches, UN schools where internally displaced people are sheltering. So this is indiscriminate bombardment. We've had MSF clinics, facilities, ambulances, as have other NGOs been targeted. So, you know, it's hard to then hear people try and describe this or justify this as collateral damage or just a consequence of war, when the realities on the ground suggest that nowhere is safe and suggest that in locations, buildings, institutions that are protected under international humanitarian law are not protected and are intentionally being targeted this targeting is being justified. There is no justification for bombing a hospital. There is no justification for shooting through a window of a hospital and killing a healthcare provider who is doing their utmost best under extremely difficult conditions to keep the few people they can alive without resources, without supplies that we haven't been able to get in. There is really an immense avalanche of human suffering that could be prevented. It is all man-made.
Dr. Tanya Haj-Hassan, thank you. Thank you for your time. I always appreciate it.
Please, I just want to add just one last thing. You were talking earlier about preliminary measures for immediate and effective measures, essentially to enable the provision of urgently needed humanitarian assistance. We know that the conditions on the ground It is impossible to do that without a ceasefire. It is impossible to get the aid to the north. It is impossible to get the aid safely to Middle Gaza. Yesterday, people who were trying to get aid that was coming in through aid trucks, thousands of civilians were ultimately shot at. At least 20 were killed, at least 150 were injured, trying to reach the humanitarian aid that had come in. And the amount of aid that is coming in is woefully inadequate. So adequate or sufficient humanitarian aid is only possible with a ceasefire.
Doctor, thank you. Appreciate that. And thank you for that last part as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Up next.